Next up, we have Jasper Lauderdale. Jasper is a doctoral candidate in cinema studies at Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, where he studies race, gender, sexuality, and temporality in radical speculative art. Jasper trained as a documentary filmmaker, an editor at Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and his work for a number of major artists has appeared in a number of places, including the Venice Biennale and the New York African Film Festival. And he's taught courses on film history, feminist media, cinematic bodies, and vampire culture at Brooklyn College, Hunter College, and NYU. Jasper will be presenting a paper entitled For the Female of the Species is More Deadly Than the Male, Exhuming the Transtemporal Body of the Black Woman Vampire in Speculative Art. Take it away, Jasper.
Amazing, thank you so much. Thank you to Genevieve and all of the organizers. This is already a very fascinating conference, and I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm going to jump right in. This is part of a much longer piece, so I hope it makes sense. I think it will. But right before, I also want to lift up that today is Audre Lorde's birthday, which is worth noting anyway, but she serves as the sort of starting point for this piece. So keep her in your thoughts. 1 year before the fearsome figure of the Black vampire projects onto the screens and into the nightmares of viewers everywhere in William Crane's Blackula. Let me share my screen, I forgot. Another awakens on the page, not abject or monstrous, but eternally radically feminist and queerly futurist. She emerges in Audre Lorde's 1971 poem Prologue, which ambivalently and remarkably lies at the close of her 1973 collection From a Land Where Other People Live. By locating her prologue at the end of the book, as a final word, Lorde both undermines the purpose of the form, deliberately misusing it, and reflects on its revolutionary potential. For though a prologue is conventionally written after the completion of the text it accompanies, it almost always appears first in published form. Lorde's is, for Alexis Pauline Gumbs, simultaneously pretextual and post-textual, a rearward look and a warning to the reader about what is to come. Quote, the queer temporality of the prologue is a privileged standpoint. She who writes the prologue has seen what the reader has not. Queerly considered, the prologue is proof that the speaker has survived the production of the text, and through having been in some way transformed or even produced by that text, she can critique it, end quote. This strategy of treating and transforming given materials, which is something I'm taking from the cinematographer and theorist Arthur Jafa, even by simply relocating or retooling an established form, is central to the idea of what I term Black radical alterity. And in textually performing such a transmutation, Audre Lorde creates a speaker who can outlast her, who can exist multiply and concurrently in the written past, the read present, and the anticipated future. Prologue opens with haunted by poems beginning with I, immediately signaling the text's reflexivity and heralding the radical subjectivity that will be granted to its vampiric narrator. Buried within are the lines, at night, sleep locks me into an echoless coffin. Sometimes at noon I dream there is nothing to fear. In light of burgeoning mainstream and commercial interest in Black horror, futurism, and surrealism in recent film and television, this paper sets out to redress the relegation of the Black vampire to the shadows of culture, both to illume its aesthetic and narrative innovations and to address the radical alterity and political potency of specifically the Black woman vampire's speculative mythology with regard to time and the body. Drawing on such conceptual models as Julia Kristeva's theory of objection, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's Body Without Organs, and Jose Esteban Munoz's coterminous temporality, I approach the undead Black body as a rhizomatic through line that collapses axiomatic temporal dimensions of past, present, and future into a kind of molten and lateral schema, a coexistent and thickened and layered moment. And thus simultaneously reflects revisionist, alternate, and anticipatory modes of imagining resistant and revolutionary possibilities. Found lurking throughout Black creative production, from performances by Aaliyah and Grace Jones, to novels by Joel Gomez and Octavia Butler, to films by Bill Gunn and Spike Lee, The Black woman vampire offers us a transmedial line of flight, a way of thinking about blackness a way out of thinking about blackness in terms of history and destiny. By accounting for and taking stock of the multivalent and intersectional ways in which many indices of difference converge in the Black vampire, I suggest that these disruptive and recalcitrant figures and the diverse narratives that they occupy habitually and fundamentally rupture binarist conceptions of embodiment, defy established logics of time and space, and radically enact the deliberate misuse of a thoroughly and immaculately white canon of dominant Western cinematic and literary incarnations. Each of them offers a singularly resistant and visionary take on a complex rhizome of past, present, and future tenses, and on a particular matrix of social, historical, and political circumstances, distilling them into a perspectival topology that's wholly inaccessible to mortal experience, a revolutionary revision of dominant practice that augments the Black woman's body so consistently deprived of life throughout history and art with immortality and a timeless point of view. The heterogeneous iterations of the Black vampire that I gather here penetrate generic, medial, and modal boundaries, resisting taxonomy and transcending form, oscillating fluently between high and low art, and confusing fleshly somatic desires for sex and sustenance. Of course, not all of the Black vampire narratives here amassed are equally or even necessarily productive, and I arrange them accordingly such that each work's particular authorial and ideological underpinning can better illumine those that surround it. I map a trajectory of cultural production from the most familiar and regressive images and narratives in which Blackness in the vampire mode is demonized, rendered as bestial, and summarily punished, to the most potentially liberatory at the end. Taken together, these texts offer more than the sum of their parts and indicate a subversive and militantly appropriative strain of Black radical alterity. So we begin with a very camp comedy horror film that has not fared well in the annals of cinematic history, but that provides us with what I believe is one of the most potently radical examples of the Black vampire on screen, which is Richard Wank's Vamp in 1986. The film is a star vehicle for the one and only Grace Jones, who plays the alluring and wordlessly intimidating nightclub owner and coven mistress Katrina. Its tedious plot is not worth the time it would take to relate it, and certainly it has its representational pitfalls, but the pure spectacle of Jones's calculated and collaborative performance, imbued with her off-screen aura, is worth the price of admission. She first appears in the After Dark Club, mounting a striptease that quickly escalates or devolves, depending on your perspective, into performance art. Initially, she opposes the voyeuristic gaze of her spectators, her body covered from head to toe. In close-up, her face is masked in white, framed by a red wig and punctuated by crimson lips, fomenting a racially confounding and highly ambivalent rendition of reverse minstrelsy. But as she disrobes, as the camera pulls away to reveal the stage and the unfragmented totality of her formidable frame, we see the blackness of her skin subversively peeking through the Keith Haring designed white patterns that continue to occlude complete visual comprehension of her form, rendering her illegible and incommensurable. It is as though she is not only co-opting the mode of the European vampire narrative, but is literally wearing its chalky flesh as a costume, one that she will summarily dispose of once she has done with it. In the same vein, Katrina's white lackey Vlad, clearly named in reference to Count Dracula, illustrates another such reversal. She controls both his sexuality and, we are led to believe, what was once his nightclub. For Giselle Liza Anatole, quote, Katrina dominates the vampire, believed by many to be the master and mold for subsequent European and US vampires, and thus doubly inverts the narrative of white male master and black slave. The social and financial power of this white man has somehow been appropriated by the black woman, end quote. Indeed, though Katrina's may be the only black body in Vamp, the white characters that surround her and people the larger narrative are either marginal, expendable, inferior, or in the case of the film's ostensible heroes, impotent and incompetent, even as they are the ones who survive her wrath in the end. Katrina shares variously with other black vampires characteristics such as immortality and abjection, an apparent inability to distinguish between feeding and sex, a gruesome facial transformation during mealtime, complete with animalistic utterances, susceptibility to fire and stakes, sarcophagus, though hers is of course graven with the likeness of Grace Jones, as well as an igneous demise at the mercy of the sun. The inept white hero who succeeds in ending her interminable tenure of undeath by exposing her monstrosity to the day, but not before her smoldering skeletal remains defiantly flip him the bird in a final and conceivably extra-diegetic fuck you to his whiteness and to the heteropatriarchal apparatus that privileges and sustains his life. Despite this amusingly resistant denouement, Anatole voices legitimate concerns about Vamp's perpetuation of regressive images of Black women's hypersexuality, particularly with respect to Katrina's seductive spectacle and her diegetic inability to return the gaze, thus directly confronting the spectator. But I think that she underestimates the radical alterity inscribed through Jones's performance, deferring to reception over interpretation, when the figure of Katrina proffers such subversive oppositionality. She takes special issue with the fact that Katrina never speaks, and though speech does not necessarily connote agency or control, Grace Jones herself in her 2015 memoir counters with, quote, "I did everything I needed to through how I moved, used my eyes, and feasted on the necks of my victims. Silent movie stuff, really. They wanted to give me words, and I said, no, I am too powerful to speak," end quote. It may be the case that some of Katrina's radicality also stems from Jones's strong identification with the figure of the vampire. She has long considered herself to be nocturnal, or as she put it in a recent interview with the New York Times, "I'm a vampire, so get over it." We turn next to the Black Mother of all vampires, the undead transtemporal Egyptian goddess Akasha, and the titular, if not quite principal, character of Michael Reimer's understandably maligned adaptation of Anne Rice's novel Queen of the Damned in 2002. Akasha's depiction does suffer from many of the familiar and damning conventions that suffuse the filmic rendering of female monstrosity and Black women's sexuality as seen in Vamp, but her situation as the originary vampire from which all others issue further displaces the Eurocentric mythos of dominant vampire lore. She first appears as a marble statue entombed with her presumed king, frozen in time and cloaked in rigid whiteness, but with phenotypically Black features that belie the pallor of the stone. When she is awoken by the vampire Lestat, she emerges from the sculpture, breaks free of its whiteness, brutally decapitating the stilled vampire king by her side so as to not bring a pretender into what will certainly be her sanguinary new age. In keeping with the vampiric tradition of transtemporal knowledge acquisition and dissemination, she learns of all that has transpired since her last reign by feeding on Lestat, ingesting the secrets contained within his blood before embarking on an immediate campaign of indiscriminate slaughter. She aspires to a return to vampiric dominance over the humans they see as food, and unlike Katrina, features the ability to occupy the light. What for Black vampires like Blade and Akasha is indicative of hybridity, however, evinces Akasha's prehistoric African purity. Akasha's violently imperialist designs demonstrate a fairly problematic instance of historical, modal, and racial script flipping. As Zélie Asaya astutely observes, she can be said to embody, quote, "the horrors of fascism," but her color redefines this as a Black story, a story of struggle for equality and revenge for centuries of immense brutality. Césaire and Fanon both compare colonialism to a system of rape and revenge. In her Psychosis, Akasha revisits the sins of the white forefathers on their children, using their traditions, burning and pillaging against them, end quote. Narratively, her actions and ambitions are brutal and indefensible, but extra-diegetically, they may well be read as retaliatory and retributive. But in keeping with the cinematic legacy of offing unruly Black women vampires, Queen of the Damned damns its queen. Akasha is drained by a group of her purportedly altruistic white progeny and returns briefly to her statuary form, though this time her body hardens into an idol wrought of obsidian or onyx before disintegrating into a billowing plume of ash and smoke, dust to dust, as it were. Even so, she remains a mythologically and temporally significant specimen of Black radical alterity, for unlike many instances in which the Black vampire travels through time, Akasha, in a sense, brings the past with its myriad horrors forward into her future and into the film's present, collapsing the tenses into a flattened and coterminous time. As opposed to Katrina, whose wire bras and elaborate headdresses and body paint need not conform to any social confines out with the queer space of her performance, Akasha's regal, revealing Egyptomaniacal attire bears with it the bygone terror and impending threat of her reborn dominion over both life and on death. So I turn now then to depictions of militant Black feminist vampires who incorporate gender into their radical alterity and succeed narratively in supplanting both whiteness and masculinity in their appropriation of the vampire mythos. I say narratively because there are more radical and far deadlier imagistic, representational, corporeal, temporal, and mythological instantiations of the, quote, female of the species discussed above. But predictably, they all die in the end, dispossessed of their immortality, killed off by their text in spite or more often because of their radicality. In these films, the woman vampire lives on. So the first then is a Trojan horse of the blaxploitation era that underwent several destructive studio recuts before being released in its intended form, Bill Gunn's Ganja and Hess from 1973. Ganja and Hess is an insubordinate and aesthetically disconcerting avant-garde masterwork, a loosely plotted assemblage of intensities and sensations that, like Queen of the Damned, after it relocates the origin of the vampire legend and thus unseats its ostensible whiteness. Gunn juxtaposes cinema verite style footage with lingering, carefully framed static shots, blends contemplative voiceover narration with muffled, opaque dialogue, and crosscuts ferociously between temporal dimensions with unsettling abandon. The film stars Dwayne Jones, who we heard about in the first introduction to today's panels, who 5 years before had inspired white controversy over his central role in Romero's Night of the Living Dead, as one of a very small cohort of Black men who make it to the end of a majority white American horror film. Jones plays Dr. Hess Green, a bourgeois anthropologist obsessed with collecting African antiquities and situating them alongside Western objets d'art in his stately country home, as far from the lived experience of American Blackness as he can get. One such curiosity is a dagger hewn from bone, a metonym for the vampire's fang, that dates back to the pre-colonial and fictive Murthian civilization, and from which Hess contracts his viral illness, an addiction to blood, and a barely veiled metaphor for drug dependence. According to Harrison Sherrod, Gunn upends the convention of the shadowy antagonist that reflects our cultural anxieties, quote, by emphasizing the tragic perspective of vampirism mythology, thereby wielding it as an exemplum for African-American history. Though the vampiric virus ostensibly lends the host immortality, Hess is ultimately portrayed as sickly and enervated, a far cry from Dracula, end quote. He argues that in Ganja and Hess, vampirism is slavery. It designates a viral colonization of the body and a denial of one's ontological status as human. That is, a realization of the demagogic germ rhetoric wielded against Blacks throughout history. When Hess's schizophrenic research assistant commits suicide in his bathroom, the latter's wife, Ganja, comes looking for him, and after a brief affair, she and Hess move on together. Hoping for an eternity with her, he infects Ganja with his affliction. But in a peculiar and stimulating twist, Ganja takes to the contagion better than Hess. After a period of supplementing their insatiable appetites with donated fluids purloined from local blood banks, Hess invites a guest for dinner, and Ganja fucks him before the couple drains him. They dispose of the body, but before long, Hess becomes despondent, fearful of his interminable futurity. He relinquishes his immortality, sacrificing himself in the shadow of the cross, pleading with Ganja to join him. She declines, electing to remain immortal. As Mancha Jawara and Phyllis Klotman note, quote, she has learned to like blood because, like a hallucinatory drug, it helps her escape into a land of pleasure. Although she did not willingly become a vampire, she takes control of the situation when she realizes what has happened. She enjoys the earthly paradise Hess built because it is immediate and real, end quote. Here, Gunn treats us to a masterful succession of images from throughout the film, cross-cutting rapidly through time and space, collating shots replete with imprecise framing and imperfectly perfect sound bridges that make it difficult for the viewer to know what, when, or where we are regarding. Finally, though, the camera comes to rest on Ganja looking out the window as the undead dinner guest emerges from the pool and runs toward her naked. Holding it for, her expression is initially blank, but after a beat, she looks at the camera and returns our gaze, holding it for just a moment before the slightest of grins appears on her lips. Cut to black. In this fleeting, magnificent moment, it is in this fleeting, magnificent moment that her radical alterity is confirmed. Ganja, unlike so many of the vampires who came before, will live forever. Ganja does also, though, return in Spike Lee's 2014 remake to Sweet Blooded Jesus, co-written with Bill Gunn, but with a few narrative revisions and one radically significant intervention. Spike's joint is less a remake and more a wholesale reimagining that displaces Gunn's incommensurably surrealist aesthetic and imposes his own signature hyper-realist coloration and overt political allegory while preserving much of the original's fetishistic iconography. But the most bracing emendation is the replacement of the hypermasculine dinner guest cum dinner with a woman. The sex and murder remain, but in this case exist out with the heteronormative paradigm upheld in Ganja and Hess. In the end, after Hess's expiry, Ganja stands on the beach in Martha's Vineyard, presumably contemplating her immortality as lonesome vampires are wont to do. The woman she killed, Tangier, walks slowly toward her naked and undead. They stand side by side, looking out at the water and presumably contemplating their interminable futurity together, as coupled queer vampires are wont to do. For Amanda Hobson, the Sweet-Blooded Jesus, quote, offers an exploration of the connection between sexual desire, violence, and blood, and one in which it is ultimately the Black women who survive and thrive. Their sexual fluidity and their sexual fluidity and their ability to adapt to the circumstances of life allow them to persevere when others are unable to do so. Ganja looks at the camera, returning our gaze, cut to black. The trajectory that I have mapped herein, from brutally regressive condemnations to radically liberatory iterations, culminates in one of the most mythologically innovative, formally striking, and politically provocative engagements with the transtemporal figure of the Black vampire, one that is deeply aware of its visual and literary antecedents, even as it looks hungrily ahead to tomorrow. Nikiatu Jusu's 2018 short film, Suicide by Sunlight, The Mask Has Nothing to Do with the Pandemic, combines the parabolic legacy of Blade and Akasha with the aesthetics of Gunn and Lee and the revolutionary Black feminisms of writers like Joelle Gomez and Octavia Butler to fashion a haunting near-future tale that drops us precipitously in medias res, with the only reference to white vampirism being an expositional nod to its comparative inadequacy. A reporter muses in the background of the opening sequence on white vampires' limited ability to pass as human due to melanin deficiency. Suicide rehearses ravishingly many of the generic mainstays we've encountered elsewhere: addiction, duration, hedonism, allegory, without offering an origin story or even acknowledging how long humanity has been aware of the vampires in its midst, and punctuates visually its straightforward narrative of motherhood and longing with cutaways to shots of beautiful, toothy Black vampires that return our gaze as they pose for Jusu's camera. But her real intervention lies in this figure of Valentina, a pediatric nurse whose professional commitment to care is sometimes at odds with her base desire to feed, a mother whose estranged twins' faith and hope know not who or what they really are. Vampirism in Suicide by Sunlight, this bloody, carnal, mythic appetite, is revealed in the film's breathtaking final moments to be genetic, hereditary, transmitted through generations, and not passed as contagion, inherited by girls whose human father Langston is, quote, dying in dog years, end quote. The porous and indeterminate balance Valentina strikes between consumption as requirement for survival and as pleasurable loss of control is shared by at least one daughter, and exposes the complex, conflicted humanity housed in her almost human body. Beneath the dermal narrative of Blackness as advantageous, as superior, which is a radical gesture in and of itself, lies the film's radical sensitivity toward what it means to place a Black woman, a Black mother, at the center of this ancient mythos. This is Black horror with conscience, consciousness, a productive incursion into a low form that adjoins speculative art and fantasy to history and lived experience. More than Katrina, Akasha, even Ganja, Valentina approaches the vampire speaker of Audre Lorde's prologue, for her eternal legacy rests in her daughter's hope and faith. The children remain like blades of grass over the earth, and all the children are singing louder than morning. Thank you, and sorry for going over.
Thank you, Jasper. Thanks so much.